Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here today as we convene this important webinar titled Beyond Temporary Protection and the Future of Displaced Ukrainians in the EU. In reflecting on the circumstances that bring us together, it is crucial to recognize the reality of the conflict in Ukraine. For over 500 days, the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine has inflicted immense suffering on Ukraine and its people. The future, however, remains highly uncertain, with no immediate end of the war in sight. And this unfortunate reality underlines the importance of our discussions here today. Europe has responded to this crisis with remarkable solidarity. Countries near and far have opened their borders and their homes to millions of displaced Ukrainians. The introduction of temporary protection in the EU and other hosting countries like Switzerland was a significant and pragmatic step. It has undeniably helped to maintain relative stability on a continent that again was haunted by war and mass displacement. However, as bold as the introduction of temporary protection was, we knew from the start that its success hinges on a comprehensive and well-considered exit strategy. Addressing the eventual end of temporary protection raises numerous policy questions, requires careful coordination and resource allocation, and above all, demands unity in purpose among hosting countries and the Ukraine alike. Today, we are about 20 months away from the maximum duration of temporary protection. And here at ICMPD, we have been providing support to the Ukraine, to our partners and friends there, to host countries, and importantly, to displaced Ukrainians from the beginning. Also from day one, we have been actively preparing for the exit from temporary protection, stimulating the reflection process and exchanges between hosting countries and Ukraine, preparing policy options, addressing exit scenarios. Our discussions today will focus on the question of remain as one viable scenario once temporary protection ends. We must navigate, as mentioned, complex legal, policy, and practical questions and considerations, not forgetting the critical need for European consistency. We are set to explore a number of innovative policy options that have been put on the table in the discussion today. But before handing over to our moderator today, Marlene Frankenhauser, I would like, in this context, to mention Ukraine's resilience in maintaining a functioning government and administration despite the ongoing conflict. And this is important because their partnership is invaluable, especially in the context of offboarding and off-ramping temporary protection in the EU. While we have no Ukrainian colleague on today's panel due to the focus of the discussion, we're still glad that many of our Ukrainian colleagues and partners are participating in this online event, and I want to extend a special welcome to them. And finally, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speakers today, Mr. Lodewijk Asscher, the Special Advisor for Ukraine for the EC, Mr. Niels Coleman, Special Envoy for the Minister for Migration for Refugees from the Ukraine of the Netherlands, Mrs. Catherine Wohler, Director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, ECRE, and ICMPD's own Martin Wagner, who is Senior Policy Advisor for Asylum. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the reins to our moderator for today's discussion, ICMPD's Head of Policy, Marlene Frankenhauser. Marlene, over to you.
Thank you, Lucas. Yes, despite the growing urgency and the very important coordinated exit strategies, there have been very little discussion on what to do when temporary protection ends, at least publicly. There have been some discussions held behind closed doors. Already a year ago, we started also to discuss what will happen after temporary protection and held an initiative together with IGC and several meetings with the joint membership of ICMPD and IGC and other international organizations. We've also published 2 discussion papers to share our thoughts and to stimulate the discussion around this. The last one was shared just a week ago, or published a week ago. We will publish the link in the chat for those who haven't had the chance to see it yet. As Lucas mentioned, the scope of today's discussion is really to focus more on Remain, but of course there's a number of options that need to be taken into account that go beyond just Remain, including transnational solutions, and we will go a bit into also looking at the potential of linking a temporary stay to reconstruction of Ukraine, and of course return as well. So, but today we focus specifically on policy and practical options concerning those who wish to remain once temporary protection ends. I'm very happy to have this distinguished panel to moderate today. Thank you all for joining us. First, the way we will work is we will have 2 rounds with our panelists. If you have questions that you would like to ask, please post them in the questions and answers section. And we will try to respond to as many as we can at the end of those 2 rounds, if they have not already been addressed in the discussions. If you have a question specifically for us as the organizer, please use the chat function to communicate with us. So with that, let's get started. So we'll focus first really on what policy options we have post temporary protection, and then in the second round look a bit at some of the practical implications of those. I want to give the floor first to Martin and ask you what actually are the available policy options for addressing the end of temporary protection. If you can get us started there.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. And also from my side, I'm also very happy that we managed to convene this webinar, because as Lucas and Malin both already mentioned it, I think the urgency is there. It is a timely discussion. We need to start rather soon. The window of action is quite limited, and I think we will come back to that in the course of the webinar a few times. Before I come to the options, I probably have one word. We have the Temporary Protection Directive that provides protection to more than 4 million in new countries plus. And in the Temporary Protection Directive, there is actually mentioned what happens when temporary protection ends. Namely, when temporary protection ends, the general laws on protection and on aliens in the member states shall apply. This is what we have in the directive. But of course, this is something that would mean that each member state decides themselves how to exit temporary protection. And I think it was mentioned already, one of the biggest positive benefits that broadly is discussed from temporary protection is actually that this concerted approach we have seen from the beginning on. Now, nevertheless, I will just have a few thoughts on the options that are available, and will also give a few of issues that already come with each of them. I would like to start with something that is probably the most logical in a way, because it's about protection. There could be, of course, mainstreaming of beneficiaries of temporary protection to the asylum procedure. I think what we have here is 2 major issues, I would say. I think one is a legal eligibility issue. It is not very clear whether refugee status or subsidiary protection status could be granted or will be granted. The refugee definition has certain criteria, and some of them might be difficult to merge in this or marry in this instance, and also subsidiary protection has such legal issues. I will not go into detail, but there are some issues where one could see, okay, this might be a problem. The other thing that is an issue is actually regarded as the main reason why temporary protection was entered in the first place, meaning to ease the administrative burdens that would happen if all enter the asylum procedure. And if you look at this latest discussion paper that we issued, we looked a bit what it would mean if 25% or 50% of those temporary protection beneficiaries would remain really in the countries. And I just will also illustrate it. Please have a closer look. We have the tables in this discussion paper also. For the top countries, that would mean, for example, for Slovakia, who has an annual number of decisions, of asylum decisions of 103 per year, average of the last 5 years. At 25% would mean that they have an additional 25,167 applications with which they have to deal. So it is a factor by 245 times, yeah. So it means a lot of more resources are necessary, a lot of more decisions are necessary. For Poland, for example, they have an annual decisions of roughly 3,000 decisions per year, and they would need to decide another 248,000 if 25% remain. We also have the calculations for 50%. This is, of course, even a much higher number. So this is an administrative procedure that would be very, very cumbersome, very difficult, and actually we would come there where we wanted to avoid, what we wanted to avoid in the first place with the Temporary Protection Directive. Another possibility would be, of course, to mainstream into legal residence status, so the normal ones for employment, education, or family reunification, for example. Also here we did some calculation what it would mean with 25% remain or 50% to remain. Again, please look at the details in the discussion paper. But the burdens would be a bit less than with asylum procedures. So member states issue more residence permits than asylum permits, but still it would be quite a significant additional burden. But in addition, I would like to point out with this legal residence status also another thing. Temporary protection beneficiaries have access to a very broad range of rights, and some of those rights would get probably lost in one or the other legal residence permit. And just point to social services, insurance, and so on. This is usually a criteria in order to get a residence permit. And many might not fulfill these conditions, particularly if you look at the profile of beneficiaries of temporary protection, mainly women with children. Also, how could they convene job and care? There's also a discussion about a humanitarian protection status. This was also came up in discussions once a while. I just remind, at EU level, we have 2 protection statuses. I mentioned them already. Refugee status and subsidiary protection. We have no other protection status. So what this would mean, if we want to have a concerted EU approach, it would require some form of legal basis. If, of course, each member states has their own protection statuses and they could rely on them, but then we have again a patchwork approach. I hope Ludwig will then tell us more about the reconstruction permit. I will leave this out because this is, I think, a more innovative thing, but what was not discussed yet broadly. My last point is extension of temporary protection directive. Of course, it is not, I think, in the idea of the temporary protection directive, but if there is an agreement, if there would be an agreement that the Commission would propose one more time to the Council, I could also imagine that there comes something more. I think under the bottom line, what we see is whatever national approaches, there we have huge issues with administrative burdens that would come additionally on top, while whatever we do at EU level, what we, I think, want in one way or the other to have a concerted approach might need some legal base, and for that, the time is running, and I think I leave it with that.
Thank you, Martin. That was also a really good wrap up of the key issues. Lucas mentioned in the beginning that the war currently has no end in sight, and temporary protection directive is 3 years, regardless of when temporary protection ends and when it is possible to return. Already now, the reconstruction needs are enormous, and the time needed for reconstruction and pairing that with viable and sustainable return and reintegration means that there is no quick transition anyway from a state staying in the EU and returning to Ukraine. So with that in mind, Ludwig, you presented recently a report on Ukraine in your position as advisor to the European Commission on Ukraine, where you proposed, amongst others, a reconstruction permit. So two pillars of this proposal stand out. First, you propose a duration of 10 years, which is really long for a temporary arrangement. But of course, looking at reconstruction needs and the duration, that is not even covering the long-term perspective of what reconstruction will mean. But second, you also permit that such a permit could be announced in a joint statement by the Commission and Ukraine. So tying already in the ongoing interest and the commitment of the European Union towards Ukraine. Could you please elaborate a bit more on your proposal and the background of this?
Sure, and thanks for having me at this very interesting discussion. First, I should mention that my focus as special advisor was the integration of Ukrainian displaced persons within the EU. So the question I was asked is, after this first wave of helping people, what's happening in terms of integration in labor market, housing, education systems, etc. And my main conclusion was that in terms of integration, the Temporary Protection Directive has been an enormous success story. Integration has been an enormous and impressive success due to both the Ukrainians and receiving societies. However, as so many refugees or displaced persons have experienced, now you can see people suffering from what I've called a waiting dilemma. You don't know what's going to happen next year. Will we go back? Will we be allowed to stay? Will we have to move on? And that leads to postponing decisions on learning a language, upskilling to a job closer to your own level of expertise. And it works the same way from the side of the receiving society. Employers, especially SMEs, are hesitant to invest in workers that might go back or might have an insecure status. So if you want to solve this, and I think it's important both for the well-being of Ukrainians, as for their economic contribution, as for the burden on receiving societies, as for stability in the European Union, as for the quality of the workforce that will return one day to Ukraine, you need to solve this. Then you have to solve this puzzle of this Temporary Protection Directive that will end in March next year or the year after. My first gut feeling, of course, and I think we can easily agree on it, that we need a European solution. You don't want to go into that scenario where each country has to decide for itself, and you can see movement of people, looking for a status that fits their situation. Of course, you could also say, as the Ukrainian government's position has been, award them a full membership, but that would have consequences on the processes that are in place to qualify for a membership, and it would also have effects on other candidate member states. You could also opt for a system where they all should enter the asylum system, but it's overburdened across Europe. The Dutch government has just fallen on this topic, so that's not a good idea either. Then you could also say that they should be sent back, but I think that's not realistic and not corresponding to the solidarity that's been shown. So I have been looking for a framework that connects to the reason why Europe has shown such enormous solidarity, and that is this war of aggression by the Russians. And I think our responsibility is not just helping Ukrainians with weapons, not just helping the Ukrainians to survive this war by hosting them within our societies, but it's also to rebuild, to reconstruct, to rebuild a future for the country. So that's why I thought we need a phase that is connected to the reason why so many Europeans feel connected. Reconstruction permit. And why with the Ukrainian government? Well, I think we should be aware how sensitive this issue is if you look at it from the Ukrainian perspective. The issue, the topic of integration of Ukrainians within the EU is a cause of for gratitude on the side of Ukrainians, but also for sadness, because they have the feeling if all their children would integrate into our primary schools and stay here and help building our economies and our futures, then they might be fighting a war for a country without future. So from their perspective, it's extremely important that we connect to the reconstruction, that we enable Ukrainians to make a contribution to this reconstruction by using their skills, their networks, their ambassadorships within the European Union, by not only enabling but also facilitating traveling to and from parts of Ukraine that have been liberated and can be rebuilt, and therefore also give some of the initiative, return some of the initiative to the Ukrainian government, instead of just from a European point of view, EU point of view, saying, well, this will be your status. And I think it also helps the Ukrainians that suffer from this dilemma, because many of their husbands or fathers or sons are still on the front, so they don't want to, get disconnected, but they also don't see themselves live there now as their houses are destroyed, or they're still, their houses are still part of the battlefield. So that's why I advocate the reconstruction permit, combining those aspects, bringing in the position of the Ukrainian government, which is a very legitimate position in my view, but also enabling millions of Ukrainians to move on with their lives, invest in their futures, work at their own skill level, and help their children to grow up in as good circumstances as possible.
Thank you so much. I think that is really key, and we also know from other situations that integrating quickly in terms of being able, having agency, in charge of your own life, and not standing still, but being able to continue to develop professionally and in other ways, and being part of a community, is also conducive to effective return. So exactly. Being able to actively contribute to the reconstruction, being able to be an active player who learns something and can bring that back to Ukraine is of course crucial. And I think so that is the right narrative and approach. Niels, if I could turn to you next. You've been very engaged in our discussions to date. What options does the Netherlands see as the most appropriate one or ones right now? And also, what are your impressions from discussions that are being held with member states?
Sure. Thank you, Malin, and thank you for inviting me here. Many thanks to the remarks of former Deputy Prime Minister Usher and the excellent report that he wrote, which I think is an invaluable addition to the debate. Thank you, Martin, for the really concise overview of options that you gave us already. I think I would have three key points to add, and partly points that have been made already, so I'm just reinforcing those. Before I enter into that, maybe just a quick remark that I'm voicing primarily my own convictions and opinions here. Why am I saying that? This allows me to speak more freely, which I prefer, but also, and Mr. Usher mentioned it already, the Dutch government actually fell last Friday, so determining positions is always a bit more complicated in the days and weeks after such an event. So having said that, my first point would be, whatever we choose in terms of prolonged stay of displaced people from Ukraine after March 2025, we need to do it together in a unified, concerted manner at EU level. My second point would be, whatever we announce in terms of prolonged stay, we need to talk about returns as well. Preferably at the same time, we would also say something about, if not a plan for return, at least the contours of one or a perspective for return. And my third point would be that it would seem that some form of flexible humanitarian status would be the most suited for the bulk of the people that we are talking about, not excluding, of course, other pathways that might be available. So my first point, why should we do this together? The point was made already. If the Commission doesn't take a lead here, because I think that is what would be required firstly, if we do not have an EU approach, then every member state will come up with their own solutions, which leads to a patchwork of statuses, which leads to people adrift on the move, lots of secondary movements, and I don't think that is in anybody's interest. And I think most member states would agree with that point of view. It also means that that time is not a luxury that we have. March 25 seems a long way away, but it isn't, because we have elections mid-2024. We all know that EU solutions take time. If the EU does not come up with something, member states need to come up with something, and that might mean legislation, which also needs time. An average legislative pathway at the national level take 15 months. So counting back from March 2025, we would need to hear from the EU level what to expect by the end of this year. Just to be very clear on that, I think that is the time frame within which we are working. Now, why should we talk about returns at the same time? I think this is important to ensure continued public support. I think it's important to provide a perspective to host communities, governments, ministers, who are also, of course, eyeing the day-to-day, year-on-year cost of hosting large populations of displaced persons. I think it is, of course, important for displaced people from Ukraine, because I think many of them still want to return and contribute to their home country, and that is something that we should be clear about in expressing that we want to help them with. And I think it is important in answer to the Ukrainian state, who has been equally explicit in saying from the start of the conflict, listen, we want all our citizens back and as soon as possible. So all those things together make a objective discussion on return very important to have, because we need to prepare also for this. We're not talking about forced return, we're talking about voluntary return, but this would be a return operation the likes of which we have not yet seen. I think perhaps even going beyond the return operations we saw after the conflicts in the Balkans. And we have important choices to make. Do we or will we focus on return and reintegration and providing support? If so, that needs a lot of financial support. If so, I think we should do this at EU level as well to prevent return shopping, because that is something that we also sometimes see, and that could lead to people moving as well. But that is a choice to make. We might also say, well, we're not looking at a return and reintegration operation, we are looking at a repatriation operation. We should be focusing our assistance to the Ukrainian state, helping them, local municipalities, what they need to bring their citizens back home. This might seem semantic, but they are very different in nature, and we haven't even started a sensible discussion about what those options are. And I think when we decide or give clarity on prolonged stay, we need to be working on returns as well. Now, why, the third point, would some kind of flexible humanitarian status seem the most suitable solution? I think much has been said already. Asylum really doesn't seem an option. Even if 25 to 50% of the people here would remain, which is, I think, the estimate that ICMPD included in your excellent second paper on this issue, it would still overwhelm asylum systems in most EU member states, certainly mine, which is already in a state of asylum crisis. Also, as was stated, the outcome is unclear. So if an asylum application is rejected, that brings forced return into focus. And I don't think that is something we want to be discussing or considering neither at the political level nor at the operational level. Work permits, study, great for people who qualify for that, and we should stimulate that as much as possible. The reality probably is that the large bulk of people will not be able to qualify. Not everybody is in a job, and very many people, I think, work part-time. Too many are working under their qualifications, so are unlikely to meet salary requirements and other requirements for a work permit. Same thing for education. Not everybody is engaged in university studies or something similar. Plus, these statuses are uncertain. If your degree finishes, if you lose your job, then your residence right ends as well. And again, you end up in a situation of no residence title where you would need to enforce returns. And that's something we're not ready for. So that leaves probably required for the bulk of the people. We're talking about some form of humanitarian status, which is flexible, allows for coming and going, allows for access to many of the services that people have now. And if you then think ahead a little bit, we have the Temporary Protection Directive, which seems to be fit for purpose. It is only valid for 3 years. That is an issue. So I think one of the options at EU level to discuss first in all openness and in all its operational and legal consequences is what amendment might be necessary or required, or whether it might be possible to reactivate, so to speak, the TPD for another 3 years. Is that legally possible? What are the downsides, advantages or disadvantages? These, I think, are one of the first types of issues we should be looking at within the scenario that prolonged stay might still be required after March 25. And just in closing, March 25 is a cliff edge right now. If we do nothing, then people will most likely resort to the asylum procedure. The challenge will be, or the question really is, do we move that cliff edge further towards the future, or do we try and turn it into a gentle slope, so to speak? You know, and I think probably a combination of both is necessary, having a prolonged stay for the bulk, but also in the meantime, trying to evolve people into other statuses and having that gentle phasing out as much as possible. I think that is something not to forget either.
Thank you. So there's a need to buy more time, most likely, and to look at other options that could work as a transition. We also, of course, do not know if in March 2025 the war is still ongoing at the same intensity as now. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to Catherine at this stage. You have in a recent conversation mentioned that you would prefer that all options would remain open. How would you envisage such a solution, also with a view to what has been said here, and how could this be brought in line with a concerted exit strategy if all options remain on the table?
Yes, thank you very much. So our strong recommendation remains that all options should remain available, because one of the primary concerns is to ensure that people have status, whatever that may be. So those are the variety of options that already exist in national and in EU law, and possibly, to add further complications, even adding new options into EU law, which has been suggested by the previous two speakers, and I'll comment on that. And just to note, I think it is also important to separate the two distinct but related questions of status and the content of protection, the rights that are attached to status. While the EU's response and the response of the member states, thanks to the activation of the TPD, has been consistent in terms of status and, in theory, the basic minimums when it comes to rights, research that we've just done, that we're about to publish, shows that there's a really extreme lack of harmonization when it comes to access to rights. So that is already a question, and it is that question of access to rights, the content of protection, the inclusion piece, that is a primary driver of onward movement in any situation of protection. So going through, as we say, keeping all options open when it comes to status, the one general point we would make is that status and what status people have should always be based on the informed consent of the people themselves, of Ukrainians, and avoiding a situation where there is a coercive or forced approach. The available options that we see start with assisted voluntary return. And the EU has significant experience in supporting AVR programs. Member states run AVR programs. And the EU, I think, is in a good position to support AVR with a return coordinator position in place, with EU funding being able to be used under the current MFF for supporting return. And if this is linked to reconstruction, as has been suggested, even better. And the issue there, of course, is the practical one of what we might call the gender issue as well. What will happen to the people, the men who are currently fighting, and at the end, if some form of peace agreement is put in place, even though we expect violence will still continue in some regions, even if there is a partial ceasefire, but the risk that people who are fighting will then leave to rejoin family members. Instead, I think there is scope for all kinds of interesting options that link reconstruction and return of people who have left and keeping people who are still there. The Ukraine itself will face a demographic crisis if it loses more population, of course. And we also highlight this particular option because it is the option preferred by many from Ukraine, including our member organizations who still operate there. We then have temporary protection regimes, extension of temporary protection directive. We issued a statement urging an extension up until the allowed limit of 2025 as soon as possible, for the reasons previously stated. Beyond that, an amendment to the TPD could extend it, could allow it to be used, but that would need a legal, an amendment to the instrument itself. Outside that, there are also questions of national level temporary protection regimes, which were widely used in response to the Yugoslav crisis, that are there in case the EU doesn't offer options in terms of the extension of TPD. Moving down, employment-based residency rights are already happening, and they're in the sense that people are transferring to those paths in certain countries. And other bases for residency under national law, student, vocational study, etc., also important. And then coming to the EU level, the long-term residence directive reform, I think, is extremely important to have the amendment that allows that to be applied to temporary protection beneficiaries, and the reforms of the Permis Unique, the single permit directive, which an attempt to encourage its use by member states because it is not taken up very widely. And then the final option after all of these is protection, is a status based on the need that the person has for international protection. The right to apply for asylum remains and should always remain. However, we would argue that avoiding the asylum route at all costs is essential for the reasons that have been stated. And asylum systems will be overwhelmed, but under EU law, it's not obvious that most people would qualify, certainly not for refugee status, and probably not for subsidiary protection unless they're from parts of the East. And even then, member states may be applying the internal protection alternative. So under EU law, is there a need for a new protection status? Humanitarian protection status exists in national law, not in EU law. Under the reform proposals, there's a proposal from the Parliament for prima facie recognition mechanism that could be useful. The immediate protection proposal from the Commission could be useful. A reform of EU law that introduces humanitarian protection status into EU law would be extremely good, so long as member states are allowed to maintain humanitarian protection status in national law. And I'll conclude on this point. We've seen in recent years a removal from national legal systems of humanitarian protection statuses, which is extremely worrying. That the main consequence of that has been that more people have no status at all. And there are people, quite large numbers of people who have protection needs, who cannot be returned. There's human rights concerns often, but who don't qualify for refugee status or subsidiary protection. There has been pressure from the EU, even for member states to remove these statuses from their national legal systems. And the case of Italy is the paradigm case here. I think that was extremely unwise, and reintroducing those options, using those options and considering whether they should also exist in EU law is crucial. All of this is desperately urgent. There has been a lot of focus on the reform of EU asylum law and the pact, to the detriment of finding a long-term solution in the Ukraine case. EU coordination is essential. The assertive role of the Commission is one of the things that has made this a successful response to displacement, notwithstanding all the humanitarian crises that we see. But it may not be that there is one solution at EU level. It may be coordination. It may be coordination of a patchwork, to use Martin's expression, and I'm sure he will explain why that's a problem afterwards. And then finally, funding, guidance, everything coming from the EU level is extremely important, even if it's not possible to have a unified status or to introduce new statuses into EU law, which we would support, but politically may not be possible. But finally, I would underline a point that will come up in the next discussion, which is the severe problem of lack of harmonization when it comes to inclusion, which is a general problem. It's not EU competence. So what the EU can do is limited, but it's sometimes, there is sometimes a tendency to say there's nothing that can be done at EU level, where in fact there is a lot. And it's those issues that will create onward movement, panicked access to attempts to exercise asylum systems, and other mismanagement. Not mismanagement, sorry, I mean like a sense of crisis that leads to this becoming a problem.
Thank you for explaining exactly what you meant there with all options. It's about having really all options available so as to not narrow it down to just one, and also to really look at a potential new type of humanitarian status, also in line with what Niels was suggesting. Turning now to more practical considerations associated with these different options, if I could go back to you, Niels, and just from your perspective, what are the challenges? Because there are challenges already, Catherine, you pointed to also the actual content of protection, the fact that access to rights is already looking different. There's a number of very practical, both administrative and host country challenges that are already in play. What would a transition from temporary protection to more long-term solutions mean for host countries? What are you considering from the Dutch perspective, Niels? And how could these be addressed?
Well, I mean, our focus today is on the residence right, which is complicated enough. But really, the landscape behind that, once you ensure residence and prolonged residence, is perhaps even more complex, because, as you said, access to services needs to continue as well, and there's often scarce resources, and this group might not fit entirely as a profile with the access to services in the way that we've organized it in our societies, right? So we have been engaged since the start of the war, really, in looking at our policies in all areas: access to healthcare, education, employment, housing, access to subsidies, and it's creating a network of very complex policies, exceptions to rules and regulations, and that will need to continue for longer. I think you will find that many policies were introduced from the idea that it would be temporary, but once you have a multi-annual perspective, you might choose to design things differently. And as we move from 2 to 3, perhaps even longer, I think member states will all start to need to think or rethink the options that they've come up with. Emergency shelters, I think, is one of the main things. Of course, the immediate response in an emergency situation is to make sure that people have shelters. We have created them all over the country in a very decentralized manner. They are not all suited for long-term stay. So we are looking to devolve those shelters and move people into more permanent forms of housing, which is of course complicated because there are enormous shortages on the housing market, and there are enormous waiting lists and shortages for council housing with affordable rents, and there are building restrictions because of climate targets. So those are not easy to overcome. You need to rethink the solutions you put in place so that they also benefit host societies, and they are flexible enough to remain in place for longer if and when people do start returning home, which is something that we, of course, all hope for. So I think the main challenge is really there, which is that there is significant hosting of displaced people in European societies. This is an important contribution in terms of solidarity, one that I think everybody's committed to keep up for a very long time, or as long as possible. But there is pressure on all those sectors that I mentioned, because it's easier said than done. You need to have housing for people. You need to have sufficient schools to educate their children and adults. You need the hospitals, doctors and nurses to treat them when they are sick. And that is not a small feat. I think these are all areas under pressure already, to which this added burden has arisen in the last year and a half. And if we're looking at it now, a period from maybe perhaps 3 to 6 years, it will mean some rethinking, recalculations on the part of most member states, certainly mine.
Thank you. No, that definitely there is and needs to be a shift from the short-term reaction to longer-term thinking, and how long that perspective should be. Another temporary protection directive extension, another sort of 4 years from now, or 10 years, looking at the reconstruction permit idea. Regardless of that, it of course has big implications, and thank you for sharing a bit of that picture from the Netherlands. Lodewijk, you have traveled extensively now for your report and consulted with EU member states and engaged with major EU hosting countries. So we're curious to know what your key takeaways were from these discussions and how they influence now your current proposal also for the reconstruction permit. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of those impressions.
Sure, and I think the points I make follow up on what Niels is saying and what has been said before, because I haven't focused on the Netherlands, but more specifically on the frontline member states, the countries that have received most refugees, but also I've spoken, of course, to other member states. And one of the things I was worried about, and the European Commission was worried about, is the so-called solidarity fatigue, that after this first crisis-like phase where people have hosted people in their spare bedrooms or their garden houses, the pressure Niels was describing kicks in, and once again, displaced persons or refugees will be considered the cause of the problem instead of the victims of a war of aggression. So if you look at solidarity fatigue, I think there's a number of things that have been developed that are interesting. I've seen a lot of innovation, especially in member states that did not really have an infrastructure or a tradition of hosting large groups of refugees. We've seen an enormous, impressive innovation in terms of combining services to make sure people feel at home, but also regain their economic independence, therefore decreasing the pressure on systems as described by Niels. So it's really important to adopt, to copy and adapt those innovative methods to make people stronger and give them their decency. Second, I think it's been very important to take into account the vulnerable people within receiving society. I think it's one of the things Niels also mentioned, but last winter we've seen this cost of living crisis raging through Europe with energy prices spiking, etc. And this was, I think, a very crucial phase in terms of also framing the war and framing the position of Ukrainians. And we also know that the Putin regime actively promoted or tried to promote a discourse saying, well, our problems are caused by those refugees. And you've seen all member states taking measures to alleviate the burden on the vulnerable groups in the receiving society. However, they were temporary measures, they were short-term measures, they were not always sufficient. And I think if you want to protect solidarity within the EU, this is a very important framework to look at what needs to be done. If not for moral or social reasons, for geopolitical reasons, because we just cannot afford to lose this part of the war of values that is also occurring. Third point I would like to make is that most of the work on the ground is not done by national governments or the member states themselves. So I always spoke to the government, to the minister, the responsible minister, but also to the city, to the NGOs, and to representatives of the refugees themselves. Because those four levels need to be taken into account. And I think here, to respond to this point of the Commission not having competence on inclusion measures, etc., you can make a big difference by enabling direct funding to NGOs, enabling direct funding to cities that take a very practical approach in building houses, in providing education, in opening up possibilities. And NGOs have, played an enormous role in not waiting for political decisions, but stepping up, and therefore making sure that there did not arise a push factor in the countries that have received most refugees, pushing them to other member states, because that was, I think, a very serious and legitimate risk. If it's unlivable at the border of Lviv or in Czechia, where, as we all know, almost 5% of the population are consist of Ukrainian displaced persons, then you would have another secondary migration wave with, I think, a lot of negative consequences. So if you combine all those things, I think there's a lot of positives on the way we've seen Europe responding. I think after over 500 days, solidarity is still alive and kicking. And solidarity not only of politicians, but also in the general population is, of course, is being monitored. I think some of the lessons we've learned are, very important. And I think it's also interesting to see that some of the countries with this infrastructure and tradition can learn something from the countries that, have now taken most of the burden. An example, I think, is also the very consistently involvement of Ukrainian displaced people in helping other Ukrainians, therefore speeding up the network effects of providing access to labor market or providing to housing. So yes, we've seen some official European or national level instruments being devised, very important, I think very helpful. But in reality, the network aspects of the 2023 society have been much more efficient and much faster in making sure that integration took place in a very positive way. Do I imply that there are no problems? No, not at all. There are some huge challenges, make no mistake. But I think we can, try and learn from what has been successful in facing those new challenges. And yes, I think the reconstruction permit taking away this pressure of the need of a prolongation each and every year, next March 24, and then after 25, the cliff edge, as was mentioned, would be helpful in providing a realistic and pragmatic approach. Yes, it's a humanitarian approach, but it should, be also a modern approach, allowing for hybrid migration, for patterns where people can temporarily go back to Ukraine or go back to the EU, make a contribution to the reconstruction, and try to fold their lives around this. And I think that's a point you mentioned yourself, moderator. The stronger people are, the more successful efforts of return will be. I was responsible Minister for Integration in the Netherlands during the time of the Syrian crisis. And at that time, when the refugees arrived, people were with plush animals at the station, welcoming them. But a few months in, not allowing them to work, all the procedures stuck. They had become almost a problem themselves and a trauma, both to them and to society. This time, we got it right in terms of how to treat Ukrainians, but that also brings a responsibility to provide a political answer. So I completely agree that it needs to be European. And I also think that the time frame Niels painted is the correct one. So to be more precise, at the European Council of December of this year, a solution should be on the table, or should at least be discussed thoroughly, in order to make sure that you are in time to take the legal steps, that are necessary. And I think it has to start with political will. So I hope both the Commission and the member states will, take up the courage to discuss this and be very open and realistic about it.
Thank you so much. Catherine, are you hopeful, or what are your concerns when it comes to this perspective of member states taking up this challenge, and what are the biggest concerns that you as ECRISI in general now going forward more practically? Are there any red lines that you would like to convey?
So one of the concerns is exactly the one that we're discussing, the increasing insecurity that people have as a result of not knowing what happens in the medium term, and in some member states actually even in the short term, because not all have chosen to extend in practice up until March of next year, never mind 2025. So that's for that reason we've been urging action as soon as possible, and I think already it could have been taken, because at the moment member states would probably agree on a collective response, and the longer the time goes on, the more risky that becomes, I think, in terms of the risk that certain member states start to behave as spoilers, as they do on many asylum and migration issues, but as they haven't yet so far on the Ukraine response. The other concerns we're hearing from our members that are across Europe, I mean, as I mentioned, we have member organizations in Ukraine, but also in every country that's been affected by this crisis. One is this issue of access to rights and the divergence when it comes to response from country to country. I think this has to be integrated into a longer term discussion about inclusion and access to rights for all beneficiaries of international protection, whichever protection status they have, and then in turn exploring the EU's role there, which even if it's not EU competence, there are so many things that can be done, and not least through the large amount of money that's available, including the post-COVID money, but also the ESF and so on. A second concern that we have, which has been mentioned, is that civil society and society as a whole is feeling a lot of stress. For some of our organizations in countries closest to the border with Ukraine, their whole organizations, their work, and indeed their own lives have been completely transformed by what has happened as they've tried to mobilize the response. We've seen civil society, volunteers, ordinary people, professionals working pro bono, this whole of society response, which is extremely positive. I would say this is also an opportunity to revive the role of civil society in certain countries where that has been diminished due to civil society being under attack or being repressed in some way or not supported. There's actually a moment right now to take advantage of, which is to build on the civil society capacity for offering and supporting protection in displacement that has been generated and should be maintained into the long term. And we see, for instance, in some countries, Poland is an example, where local NGOs have been working on displacement outside the country and have now come back to organize this response. Poland, Estonia is also a very good example there. In other countries where they didn't have big local NGOs working internationally, there are new actors emerging, and I think that there's a moment to capitalize on that. Of course, civil society always asks for money. It's a cliche, but a large injection of money will keep that positive response moving. I would underline, I think it's particularly important because one concern here is that UNHCR, that has had a leading role in coordination with government in a number of countries, does want to move out in some cases. UNHCR sees its priorities elsewhere in the world, where the vast majority of refugees are to be found. So I think maintaining civil society, the EU playing a stronger role is all going to be important. Finally, I think there's a concern about political shifts, as everybody's mentioned, but it hasn't yet come. And so long as the situation remains under control, then I think that can be managed. The Czech Republic, of course, but also I would say Ireland, Romania, there are countries where things are very delicate, where there is a risk that the countries are just not able to cope, and it's not necessarily the most obvious countries. So that's why what we're discussing is so important. let me just check I've covered all our concerns. As a final point on this, linking with other EU policies, I think, is something that remains part of this. The TPD is part of the common European asylum system. There's many important lessons from this response which can be also more widely applied, and vice versa. The reforms of EU asylum law that are currently happening have to take into account this particular displacement crisis. But perhaps more important is the need to adapt the accession policy. Already there was a debate about updating accession policy, but the question about how to manage a membership perspective with a country that is undergoing conflict following an invasion, where there's been mass displacement, where the people from that country already have freedom of movement within the EU, and are also engaging in this form of pendular movement of returning to the country and coming back to Europe. I think it again leads to the need to reflect on the membership process and how to manage that for Ukraine and Moldova, and keep into account the countries that are already within that process, and including in relation to the next Commission and how enlargement will be managed, because there's also potential for coordination and management, as well as within the ways in which the EU can support on inclusion. Precondition for everything is the status question, as we began our discussion.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Martin, hearing the discussion so far, how does it resonate with what we have been hearing from host countries in terms of the practical challenges that they might face in this transition period, going to long-term solutions? And are there any lessons learned that you think that we can look at more carefully from other experiences?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I'm very much enjoyed now this what I heard, and I noted a few things for me, and I think what resonates the most, I think what we always heard is uncertainty and unclarity. The longer you wait into giving some perspectives what will happen afterwards. It has two dimensions, and I think it has also a dimension with what was mentioned before, the solidarity fatigue. I think because this solidarity kind of thing was actually, I think, also a reason that it was a very clear roadmap. We have temporary protection, it works like this, it works everywhere the same, this is what we do. And I think the same should or must be true with exit of temporary protection in order to remain with this kind of solidarity on all ends. And I think it has very much to do then also with uncertainty. The sooner you know what will happen afterwards, the less you will come into this trap that you need to jump on the one window of opportunity or the other that one or the other member states might open or not. This is a bit what I read out of this discussion, and I think it reflects a bit what was, I saw this question and answer here from one participant who said also, I heard about Luxembourg already offering temporary residence, but under conditions most Ukrainian citizens with temporary protection cannot meet, and in brackets, income, accommodation. And I think this is exactly what I think is important to probably avoid, that we start with some countries opening up or wanting to have this transition. And then you create a bit this uncertainty that some countries already start. Do I need to do it now also? Do I need to go into another status? What do I have to do? I go to NGOs. NGOs are not informed. Are also then overburdened with these questions and kind of things. And actually people in ministries, I guess the same, if there's not really clear and the neighboring country has already a more advanced policy. So this is, I think, what would make it very complex and patchwork. And this was what I mentioned before and what I would think should be avoided. And probably a few things also with capacity, because I mentioned it before quite strongly, and we heard it now also. And indeed, Malin, we looked into some of the examples that we can learn from other situations, and one of them that came also up once a while was Brexit, and what we can learn from Brexit. Sounds now probably a bit weirdish to have it in this context. Of course, the context in Brexit is a completely different one. But there's one major similarity, and this is there needed to be some kind of status change or some kind of renewed of status for quite a significant number of people also in Brexit. And this was more than 1 million UK citizens in the EU and even more EU citizens in the UK. And I think there were a few things that can be used in order to buy time, for example, to use this kind of transition regimes that were used. There was a transition period after UK exited the European Union. There was a 1-year transition period with afterwards another 6 months of a grace period during which people could apply for the other applicable status. And also with the status, because this was one of the discussions that we had in some of the discussion rounds that we held, was how can this transition be? Does everybody need to apply? Because this is, of course, also connected with administrative work. And in Brexit, there were two systems: a constitutive system, which required an application, or you have a declaratory scheme that goes automatically and you come automatically in the new scheme. So these are all possibilities how you can avoid or you can address an increase of administrative work. But what I found also quite interesting is when you look at this, member states could also say at what point they receive applications in order to have a new status. And this, of course, also helps national administrations to prepare for this time, yeah, that they know, okay, I know that I have to accommodate so and so many potential people who will remain and will come up with an application one way or the other. And I need some 4 months to prepare. And as of this date, then such applications can come in. So I think these are some of the things that I think we can see. And on the other side, if we look back, and Niels already referred to it, I think in the Bosnian context, we saw what would be the contrary if each country is basically left alone to do their own things. And then we had secondary movements, especially there where people wanted to remain but needed to return because this was the national policy in some of the countries in that circumstances. So I think there are issues, and we should look at these past examples to learn from them. And yeah, I believe it.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. That concludes 2 rounds. And so we now have the opportunity to for the audience to pose questions. And of course, for the panel to try to answer them. We have 1 question already, and it relates to what was mentioned on solidarity fatigue. So what can be done, what more can be done? Lodewijk and Catherine both mentioned that civil society also are under stress and should be both recognized and further supported to be able to continue their important work. The public opinion was mentioned also in the very beginning, the fact that when we need to communicate jointly as the EU on what options there are, both towards those who are the ultimate beneficiaries, but also towards the public, so that the public understands and is reassured that there is a concerted effort being made. So any comments from your side in terms of what we can do to mitigate solidarity fatigue, which would have an adverse effect on integration efforts, and what specific role are we doing enough on communication at the national level and EU level? Would anybody like to start? Lodewijk?
Well, I think Catherine already mentioned that the importance of clear messaging. So to paint a very clear perspective instead of just muddling through and waiting, what happens next year, March. That's important. Second, we all mentioned, I think, the aspect of funding. Direct funding is important, both by the EU and by national governments. Third, I think it could help to release the pressure on stressed systems if we would use 2023 as a year to invest in the skills and the abilities of Ukrainian displaced people. Because if and when they're now obviously often working below their normal skill level, which means that they will have, to use a lot of support in social housing, etc. Once more people start to move up, get upskilled, they will get better jobs and be more independent of the most vulnerable systems in receiving society. So I think that's a very, if you would put it in those words, very good business case for investing in upskilling, paying for language courses, paying for specific vocational training to make sure that they are using their capacities. Fourth, I think there's also an issue that we have not mentioned yet, but this is also a matter of fighting disinformation and propaganda by the Putin regime. We've seen numerous occasions where a small problem caused by a Ukrainian somewhere within the EU is pushed and promoted in an effort to make sure that it gets to the front pages and stays there by the Putin regime. So we should also not be naive about who is trying to break European solidarity. So those are just 4 points I think that should be taken into account when addressing this solidarity fatigue.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yes, if I may come in on that. I mean, in terms, again, I don't want to make it sound self-interested from civil society in terms of funding. And the earmarking of funds for civil society and local authorities, I think, is a good practice that comes out of this. But let's remember that is just for one part of one instrument. It's not something wider. And I think on funding, a point that's often overlooked is that member states are not how should I say that, are not necessarily managing very well to absorb EU funds. And a lot of the EU money is recycled money from other sources. In fact, states seem to be depending a lot on money that's coming in from development banks, be that the European Investment Bank, the Council of Europe Development Bank, the EBRD. And that's funding that is very hard to access beyond state ministries. And it's not always very transparent. So I think that's a dimension that could require further attention to ensure that what's coming in as development investment funding using a whole variety of different financial tools, quite complex ones, contributes to a sort of long-term inclusive society perspective. So it's benefiting Ukrainians, but it's also benefiting local community and other beneficiaries of international protection, after all. So that's one issue. Another element for solidarity, I think, is better management of the vulnerability question. There are high numbers of vulnerable people in those who've been amongst those displaced, and this is a major challenge in a number of countries. It's also a highly sensitive question for the Ukrainian government. Here, we would argue that some of the relocation options should be taken up. And relocating, for instance, disabled children, families with a number of vulnerable members, people at risk of trafficking, which is also an issue that has been considered, but where there are immense vulnerabilities, to ensure adequate support, and if not, encouragement at very least of relocation to places where the special needs of people can be provided, particularly as this turns into a longer term question. And just one final element, if I may, that I would also be interested in hearing the views of the others on, is really this question that we started with about, is there a collective EU option when it comes to the status issue? From our side, that would be ideal if there is an EU wide status option which has a consistent and harmonized approach to the content of protection with a set of rights attached to it. But in the long term, that will require legal change, because it means either an amendment to the TPD, which luckily will be kept. I mean, let's remember just 3 years ago, the proposal was to repeal the TPD. It will be kept, but it would need to be amended, or there would need to be another amendment to the qualification regulation as when it comes in, which is still pending, on creating a new status. Now, probably, I mean, maybe this can be done without amendments of EU law. I think not. And whether there's an appetite after 7 years of tense and divisive discussion on the reform of EU asylum law, I would doubt. So I think the question is to make sure that firstly, the extension until the end, legally allowed end of the TPD regime is made, but then to have a whole series of additional plans, plan Bs and Cs in place in case a collective response at the legal level is not possible, because it's not obvious. And particularly as next year the Commission changes, European Parliament changes, and then we go into Hungarian, Poland, Denmark as the strand of presidencies, none of which may necessarily be supporting EU. I mean, Poland, of course, on this particular issue is another question, but that there are political challenges may arise. So that's, I think that's why having backups may be important.
Thank you. Actually, in the questions we've received, we also have that's a similar one. What actually, how probable is this a safe bet to first extend temporary protection directive, and then what is there actually a possibility to have a collective EU status? What is your take on this, Niels?
I think first things first, I think we might need a bit more time. There are ideas being floated around, but very carefully. The least bad idea I've heard so far is, yes, to amend the TPD, perhaps reactivate it, although there are pros and cons there. Catherine, you mentioned one earlier, maybe amending the long-term residence directive. This seems to be less suitable because, well, it's very technical, but even if you amend it so that people protection can qualify for the number of years you need to have to qualify for long-term residence, you would still have a gap in the number of years that people have. In some countries such as the Netherlands, where there's actually not a residence permit given, but there is a right to remain because it's in effect a frozen asylum application, you don't build up residence rights at all. So even if you would amend a directive, you'd still have a gap in years where people need to still build up rights with some other kind of status. So even if you do it, you still need to come up with another solution, right? I've not yet heard or detected an appetite for further amendments to other pieces of European legislation that are on the table, i.e. qualification directive. There is very little talk so far about creating new statuses in that permanent sense. So although I need to be careful because we have yet to begin a sensible discussion, I repeat, at the EU level of different options and scenarios that we have, I think focusing on what we might be able to do with the TPD seems the most viable going forward.
We also have a question on whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the reconstruction permit and how Ukraine or the Ukrainian government was part of those discussions. Would you be able to give us a few more details, Lodewijk?
Yeah, well, I was advising the Commissioner Schmid and Johansson, so employment and migration. I've spoken to the Ukrainian minister twice when she was at the EPSCO council meetings, informal in October in Prague and the one in March in Brussels. And the position of the Ukrainian government is, of course, that they want to be EU members. And so that remains the official position, and that, you know, from their point of view, would be the quickest fix to this problem. However, I agree with both Niels and Catherine's objections to that route. I don't think it's the wise approach. So I've of course shared my ideas with them, and I think in general that the idea that we need to take them into the discussion be part of the debate on how to move forward is, of course, well received out there. There's not an official support for this idea that this has to be discussed in bilaterals between the Commission and the Ukrainian government first. But I've tried at least to incorporate the official position, but also the sentiments that are key to understanding why this is such a sensitive issue for the Ukrainian government and for Ukrainians both there and here, by trying to build a narrative and a framework that, so to say, allows for understanding what's happening over there, and that this is a war of aggression and they are losing lives each and every day, and therefore that reconstruction is the only, the war has to end ASAP by, making sure they reclaim the land that has been occupied, and then all focus has to be on reconstruction instead of trying to seduce or force Ukrainians to return. So I think this is a common interest of the EU and the Ukrainian government. Return is the most likely and the most favorable option. Of course, from my point of view, I think people who have integrated successfully with children in primary school should be able to make up their own mind on where to go next. I think that a more flexible approach to individual choices is also necessary to get this right. But to make it attractive or a positive thing to contribute to reconstruction, this permit could be helpful. But I haven't been to Kiev. I haven't talked. I only spoke in a more general preliminary matter about this idea with the Ukrainian minister.
Thank you. We're starting to come to 1.5 hours, which was our designated time for this discussion. There are a number of questions, of course, still on the table. For those who would like to find out more about the reconstruction permit, there is a report available, so where you can read the full details of the proposal. I'd like to turn to all panelists to see if there is a key message you would like to depart with. So what would each of you like to convey to EU institutions, to EU member states, or to Ukraine or the Ukrainians themselves on these conversations that need to take place on exit strategy? So what is your key point? May I ask Niels to start, or Catherine to start? You see you're taking the floor.
Yeah,
we'll start
I can
with Catherine.
jump in and let the others follow. And I think one is just to underline the urgency of this, and then secondly to say that there and assert, even if there isn't a single EU option in EU law or in terms of status, an active and assertive EU, and in particular European Commission, it is really of great benefit. And that has been one of the keys to the success of the political response, notwithstanding all the challenges to this crisis. Finally, I do think that there are ways to amend the long-term residence directive that would allow most people displaced from Ukraine to qualify. So we see this as central. It depends on what comes out of the legislative process. And then EU membership. I think anything that is a rapid accession and jumping the queue, absolutely not. But the membership perspective creates a framework for engagement with a country that I think it is a successful EU policy in and of itself. So even if it's something long term, that creates a framework for dialogue, and also allows for an emphasis on reform as well as reconstruction within Ukraine itself, which is a question. So I think it's just, as I said in my comments, there has to be a rethinking of how the process works for this very particular context, which was perhaps needed anyway. And a lot will also depend on the politics of this. What commissioner has that portfolio from next year onwards, how these things can be managed. And then the final point would be back to it, as we said at the beginning, from our perspective, just in terms of the practicality, ensuring above all that people have status, keeping a range of options available is important.
Martin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, and probably one word, I'm not completely sure who sees the chat and whether the attendees also see the chat, because there's one comment from the Joint Research Center, Research and GRC, saying that they will come out from them as a report on the solidarity, a report which also touches upon solidarity fatigue and disinformation. And I'm not sure whether all attendees can read it, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to also read that out. Certainly would be good to follow this. And there's also a few comments on temporary protection directive in questions and answers as regards to that there might be some issue, as there are some rumors about that temporary protection directive could be beyond the 3 years limit. I just want to raise it here also. I have no further comments on that, but probably one thing to these 3 years, I think this was one of also discussions that we sometimes had, whether 3 years is something that should be changed in the future, that you say, okay, we see it now, 3 years is very short for such a thing, and if there's a new temporary protection directive in one way or the other amended, probably to extend this time. But I think the primary reason for temporary protection, I think we should somehow try to keep, and this is temporality, but with an option, if it goes longer, that it's a clear option that you can stay also in a long-term perspective, to also make plans and everything. And I think this is something that we should try to keep the spirit of temporary protection. So either it is possible in the short term, or there must be some options also for a longer term perspective. And I think the other reason for temporary protection, I think, is equally important, avoiding this administrative more burdens or more work, and because at the end of the day, it's also for asylum seekers who are also in the procedure, they will also have to wait long, and this will go into huge backlogs anyways. So I think for me, it's something to keep the spirit of temporary protection directive alive in one way is important. If it is prolonged, I think there must be not a permanent temporality, but either a way into remain as well, and this I think must be thought about.
Thank you, Niels. How about you?
Can I try and squeeze in 4 final messages, Marlene? I'll try and do that very quickly. First, I think this is exactly the type of sensible discussion that we need to be having, and that we've demonstrated that you can do that without prejudging somehow the outcome or expectations with regard to the war. Why did I say that? I think there might be a hesitancy on the part of some EU institutions that discussing this now might send the wrong message, playing in the hands of Russian propaganda, or somehow countering the Ukrainian narrative that they can win this war in the immediate future. I think it is our duty to look at different scenarios and to prepare for them, and that some form of prolonged stay is a very reasonable scenario that we need to be ready for. Second, on returns, I think, and it's just echoing what was said, I think looking for a link with reconstruction makes sense. I think Asha's report, who has, I think, left us, says some sensible things about that, also in terms of upskilling the people while they are here. Even if we're talking about, again, temporary stay, and we say that return is important, this should not stop us from investing in people while they are in our societies. And upskilling with a view to reconstruction is not only to their benefit, it benefits host societies, and it, I think, increases their chances of return and might help reconstruction in the near future as well. So in a way, a triple win. So I think that's an important policy takeaway. Third point is I very much took Catherine's argument about the harmonization of access to services, I would just say that there is also strength in flexibility. My analysis of why the TPD is such a success with regard to this big group of people would firstly be because this group of people happen to be visa-free, enjoying a degree of free circulation within the Union, which meant that we could avoid potentially very time-consuming political and difficult discussions about distribution keys, solidarity, and relocation, which the Union has a particularly bad track record on. So that was a big help that we could skip over that. The second reason why the TPD has been a success is in its flexibility. It is a directive, it is an old directive, which means it has minimum norms open to interpretation. And this has allowed for finding local solutions of a very differing and wide range. And I think if we harmonize more, we might risk losing some of that flexibility and the degree to which there is support and the ability to absorb displaced peoples in European societies and the strains that brings. And my fourth and final message would be is also reacting perhaps to something Catherine said. I think we might well end up with a coordination of the patchwork of different solutions, but I think we've established that that would be the least preferred option and that our ambition should be higher and to set our sights on working on a solution which is as harmonized as possible at the EU level in the months to come, and that time indeed is in short supply in that regard.
Thank you so much, Niels. We've lost Lodewijk just a moment ago, but he did bring a lot of important messages to the discussion already. So I would like to wrap up here. This was just one discussion. We're really glad that you joined us all. Thank you so much to all the panelists and our guests today. Thank you to everybody who stayed online and listened to us. This is an important policy issue that we also want to continue to support and be part of from ICMPD side. For those of you who would like to tune in on news, you can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can subscribe to our news flash, so we will keep you up to date also on our contributions to this very important discussion. That's it. Have a very nice afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today.